You've probably noticed, if you pay close enough attention, that you're not quite the same person at 8 in the morning as you are at 10 at night. Not dramatically different. Same name, same face, same values you'd list if someone asked. But something is different. You're more patient earlier, more generous before noon than after a long day, more honest, more careful, more willing to do the harder right thing when the day is still fresh than when you've been moving through it for 12 hours. Most people chalk this up to mood, or tiredness, or simply the accumulation of stress. And they're not wrong, but they're describing the symptom, not the mechanism. What's actually happening underneath that shift has specific psychological and physiological roots, and understanding them changes something important. It reveals that your moral behavior, your patience, your generosity, your honesty, the quality of how you treat the people around you, is not a fixed trait. It's a resource. And like every finite resource, it depletes. By the end of this video, you'll understand the specific mechanism that explains why virtues aren't just character, why your best self and your worst self appear on a predictable schedule, and what this means for how you judge both yourself and everyone else around you. Stay with this until the end, because the final part explains something uncomfortable. That some of the worst moral decisions in human history may have been shaped, in part, by what the decision-makers had eaten or hadn't. Let's start with the foundational concept. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, psychologist Roy Baumeister and colleagues developed what they called the resource model of self-control. The proposal that self-regulation draws from a limited, depletable pool of mental energy, sometimes called ego strength. The model makes a specific prediction. Performing acts of self-control earlier in a sequence will reduce the quality of self-regulation later in that same sequence because both acts draw from the same finite reserve. This became known as ego depletion, and it was supported by an initial wave of studies that showed a consistent, measurable decline in self-regulatory performance following prior demands on the same system. Here's where it gets specifically relevant to the question of character and moral behavior. The resource model doesn't apply only to neutral acts of willpower, like resisting a snack or staying focused on a boring task. It applies equally to the behavioral demands of being a good person, being patient when you'd rather snap, being generous when saying no would be easier, being honest when a small lie would resolve the immediate discomfort. Each of these is a self-regulatory act in the technical psychological sense. It requires overriding an easier, more immediately rewarding default response in favor of a harder, more socially and ethically appropriate one. And each such act draws from the same limited reserve that ordinary acts of self-control deplete. This means your virtue, not just your productivity, not just your focus, but your actual moral behavior, is partly a function of how much resource remains in that reserve at any given moment. Earlier in the day, before the accumulation of demands, you have more resource available, and the harder behaviors, the generous response, the patient reply, the honest admission, are more accessible. Later in the day, after dozens or hundreds of small self-regulatory demands, the same behaviors require drawing from a reserve that may be substantially reduced, making the harder, better choice meaningfully more difficult. Not impossible, but genuinely harder, in a measurable way that isn't simply a matter of wanting enough. And here's the detail that changes how you should think about yourself and everyone around you. This depletion is not a moral failing. It is not evidence of weak character or insufficient commitment to your values. It is a predictable, structural feature of how human self-regulation works, operating below the level of conscious choice. The person who snaps at their partner at 9 in the evening after a hard day is, in a specific and measurable sense, not making the same quality of decision that the person who handled the same situation calmly at 9 in the morning would have made, not because their values changed, but because the resource those values depend on to override the immediate reaction was not equally available in both moments. The evidence for this extends beyond laboratory experiments in ways that are genuinely difficult to dismiss. A widely cited study on judicial decision-making tracked the rulings of experienced judges across the day and found a striking pattern. Favorable rulings granting parole, giving the benefit of the doubt, were far more likely immediately after a meal break, and declined progressively throughout each session as the judges' decision-making stretched further from their last opportunity to rest and restore. The judges were experienced professionals applying the same legal standards throughout the day. The variable that predicted leniency or harshness wasn't the case. It was timing. This finding points to something important about moral judgment more broadly. The same case, the same facts, the same person making the decision can produce different outcomes depending purely on the condition of the resource that decision-making depends on. This doesn't mean the judges were bad at their jobs, or that their decisions were meaningless. It means that every human moral judgment, however carefully reasoned it appears, is being made through a system that has physical, biological, and temporal constraints that most discussions of character, ethics, and personal responsibility don't account for at all. But here's where it becomes relevant to something more personal than judicial. Rulings. This resource isn't only depleted by self-regulatory acts in the usual sense. It's depleted by social demands, by emotional effort, by sustained attention, by making repeated decisions, and, critically, by physical factors including hunger and glucose availability. Research has consistently found that blood glucose levels, reduced by fasting or a long gap since the last meal, produce measurable decrements in self-regulatory performance. The phrase, hungry and irritable, isn't simply colloquial. It describes a real, physiologically grounded reduction in the resources available for the behavioral outputs that require overriding immediate impulses. This reveals something that most discussions of character completely ignore. The quality of your moral behavior across a day is jointly determined by your values and by your biology, not one or the other, both simultaneously. A person with strong values and a depleted resource base may behave worse than a person with weaker values and a full resource base in a given moment, simply because the biological substrate that allows values to translate into behavior is a variable, not a constant. What do you do with this? First, stop evaluating your character exclusively by your worst moments. Your worst moments are disproportionately likely to occur when resources are lowest. Late in the day, after sustained demands, when hungry or tired. These moments reveal something real about how you behave under constraint, but they're not more revealing of your true character than your best moments. Both are you under different resource conditions. Second, extend the same understanding to other people. When someone is short with you, or less generous than you'd hope, or makes a decision that seems callous or lazy, they may not be revealing their fixed character. They may be revealing their resource condition. This doesn't mean poor behavior doesn't matter, or that resource depletion excuses everything. It means the character judgment you make based on a single depleted state observation is likely less accurate than you assume. Third, treat resource maintenance as a moral practice, not just a practical one. Sleeping adequately, eating at reasonable intervals, building in genuine recovery time, and protecting space from continuous self-regulatory demand. These aren't just strategies for productivity. They are, in a direct and literal sense, strategies for being the person you actually want to be more often across more of your day. Fourth, identify your own depletion signals specifically. For most people, there are recognizable behavioral markers that appear when resource is running low before the depletion reaches a critical point. A particular kind of impatience, a lower tolerance for ambiguity, an increased pull toward the easier, less effortful choice in interactions. Learning to recognize these signals early creates a window for deliberate intervention before the depletion has progressed far enough to produce the behaviors you'll most regret. That here's what ties this together. The version of you that handled something well this morning and the version that handled something badly tonight are both genuinely you. They share values, history, and intentions. What they didn't share was access to the same level of the finite resource that translates values into behavior. Understanding this doesn't lower the standard. It locates the actual lever. And the actual lever, it turns out, is more biological and more manageable than the story of willpower and character alone has ever suggested. If this explains something you've noticed in yourself, tell us in the comments about a time when you behave in a way you regretted and later realized it happened at the exact wrong moment in your day, when you were depleted, hungry, or worn out. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own mind, the next video is right there waiting for you.